So the results of the poll are in, and Achilles has been chosen to be the next god guide. If you want to vote in polls to decide the next guide, among a ton of other benefits, check out the join button below this video. It helps support the channel and allows me to create in-depth guides like these on the channel. So without further ado, let's get into it. So as always, we'll start with Achilles' basic playstyle and overview, then all of his abilities explained and how to use them most effectively, then his itemization choices and build paths along with a full build example, and finally we'll round off the guide with a few tips and tricks to up your game on Achilles. Alright, so let's dive right in with the basics of Achilles. So Achilles is quite a unique warrior in that he has almost two types of playstyle. We'll get more into this later, especially in the build section, but Achilles can be played as your typical tanky warrior, soaking up damage, spamming abilities and healing a ton, but he can also be played as a more aggressive, almost assassin-like warrior with the right build and playstyle as well. So if either of those two types of playstyles sound appealing to you and you like Achilles' kit, then I'm sure he might be someone you want to learn. Naturally, Achilles fits very well into solo lane, but as I mentioned, he can go for a more damage-oriented playstyle, which allows him to jungle quite effectively as well. I've even seen Achilles' support be successful in the past, so he's a very powerful and flexible pick. Okay, so with his basic playstyle covered, let's get into the meat of the guide and cover all of Achilles' abilities in depth and the best ways to use them. So kicking it off with Achilles' passive, Gift of the Gods, this is where his flexible playstyle is made most obvious. Essentially, Achilles can decide in the fountain whether to wear his armor or go topless. If wearing armor, Achilles gains bonus health and protections, and if not wearing armor, Achilles gains bonus physical power and movement speed. This change lasts until you decide to change back in the fountain once again, so once you leave the fountain, you're locked into whatever stance you were in, but whenever you die or recall and are in the fountain again, you can switch. And you can do that as many times as you want throughout the game. So yeah, as I said, there are clearly two defined playstyles within this passive for Achilles. Armor being for the tanky, solo lane or support type playstyle with the bonus health and defenses, and no armor being more suited to roaming the jungle with that extra movement speed and ganking hard with the extra power. This passive provides up to 325 health and 45 protections with armor, or 6% movement speed and 43 physical power without armor at level 20. So it's certainly a very powerful passive boost to Achilles as you progress throughout the game. Alright, moving on to Achilles' first ability, Shield of Achilles. This is a pretty simple but hard-hitting cone damage ability in front of him. Enemies within a close area near Achilles will take full damage and are stunned for 1 second, while anyone outside of that close area takes 85% of the damage and doesn't take the stun. So this is super simple to use, especially once you've seen it used in action, but that doesn't mean it's not a strong ability. The stun is very easy to land if you're fighting someone in melee range, making this ability hit for easily over 400 damage plus the stun. It's also Achilles' main form of minion and jungle camp clear throughout the early game. Achilles 2, Radiant Glory, allows him to activate a passive buff for 6 seconds, granting him bonus power, protections, and crowd control reduction, as well as a heal every time he damages an enemy with an ability, which scales up from a maximum of 2 targets per ability to 4 at max rank. So when you first play Achilles, it might seem like this ability doesn't really do too much, but utilizing it correctly is key and it separates a lot of decent Achilles players from the good ones. Of course, the heals are really nice from this, and that's what you're mostly using it for. Combining this with a gladiator shield, as we'll discuss later, can be a ton of healing. But the bonus protections and power are also percentage based and not flat values, so the more of those stats you already have when you activate the ability, you'll get more out of it. It's only on a 10-second cooldown base, and it lasts 6 seconds, so you have quite a large uptime on this ability. Though it is of course worth noting that the cooldown doesn't start until the effect ends, so it's more like a 16-second cooldown. Okay, moving on to Achilles 3, Combat Dodge. This is a very short range omnidirectional dash, so you can dash any way you wish even if you're not directly facing that way. So you could be facing at an enemy and dodge to the side, for example. After dodging, you can throw a projectile that does damage to all enemies in a line. If you hit a god with it, you can cast the ability again before it goes on cooldown, so you get another dash and another projectile. So of course with this you ideally want to be hitting those gods with the first cast. A single cast of this ability is pretty mediocre, but when you can hit someone twice with it, the damage starts to build up, given it hits really hard on the base damage already and has 90% scaling if you hit twice. It's also of course very useful for quick dodges and maneuvers in fights. If you see an Achilles about to try and pull you in with his 2, you can easily read him and combat dodge to the side to avoid the ability. This also has a very short cooldown of only 10 seconds at max rank, so you can pump out a lot of sustained damage with this while also juking and manoeuvring around the fight. And one final note for this, both hits of damage will of course proc the heal from Radiant Glory, so you can double dip on the effect there. And finally, let's cover Achilles' ultimate, Fatal Strike. Achilles can dash a medium distance and stop at the first enemy god hit, dealing damage to them. However, if the enemy hit is within a 30% max maximum health threshold, they'll be executed and Achilles can use Fatal Strike again. He can repeat this up to 5 times as long as he keeps executing people with every hit. If he uses the ability but doesn't execute anyone, it will go on cooldown as normal. However, for each enemy you execute with the ability, you yourself will take 10% more damage from all sources for a short time, so there is a drawback to manage when using this ability to execute people. So this ability is definitely core to how Achilles plays. You can often get people quite low by either bursting them with high power or just spamming your 1 and 3 at them constantly on low cooldowns. Then they have to play very carefully because at any point they might drop into that 30% health threshold and you can execute them with this. In my experience though, it's usually not a 100% guaranteed hit. Take your time and try to keep on target because a quick juke from the enemy can fairly easily dodge this ability. So I recommend trying to watch their movement patterns and predict how they're going to juke. And you may also want to try and burn their movement ability before you use this because a movement ability can easily make this miss. And one final note for this ability, while using Fatal Strike you are immune to crowd control, so it can be used to preemptively immune things like Ymir's Ice Breath or an Ares ultimate for example. Alright, so with all of Achilles' abilities covered, let's get into his item choices and how to build him. So I'm going to be splitting this section into 2 main parts, jungle and solo builds. I'll also touch on support a little bit, but I want to go more in depth on solo and jungle as they're the main 2 roles you'll find Achilles in. So for solo lane, in terms of starting builds, you're pretty much always going to want Warrior's Blessing for the tankiness and sustain. Then there's a couple of viable options right now for the rest of your 800 gold. You can get tier 1 shield to rush into Gladiator shield early, tier 1 boots to rush into Warrior Tabi early, or you can just grab a health chalice and forget the tier 1 item. And then you want to fill up on health potions with any remaining gold you have for sustain in lane. After starting builds, your first item is usually dependent on how you started the game. So if you started with tier 1 shield for example, then a Gladiator shield rush first item is probably your best option. But if you went for the tier 1 boots, then a Warrior Tabi rush will be better. But keep in mind that pretty much no matter what, even if you're facing a magical solo laner, your first 2 items should be Gladiator shield and Warrior Tabi. The only exception in my opinion is if you're facing a heavy healer in solo like Aphrodite, Hel or Chang'e. In that case I will forgo the Gladiator shield and get a pestilence early on. Alright, so after you've got your shield and your boots, you generally need to start counter building for the enemy team and what you need. But here's a list of some good items and when you should be building them for the remaining slots in your build. Blackthorn Hammer is still a great item for Achilles. It can fit into literally any Achilles build as it gives tons of health, which is obviously useful against both magical and physical damage sources, but that extra power, CDR and mana can't be overstated either. Void Shield is my go-to aggressive physical defense item for Achilles right now. Usually this is great to rush straight after Gladiator Shield or maybe after a Blackthorn Hammer. It's just an extremely strong all-rounder item, giving health, defenses, penetration and power all in one. Pestilence, as I mentioned before, should be your go-to magical defense if the enemy team have a lot of healing. In the absence of significant healing, I like Genji's Guard in that spot as my magical defense. Tons of defense, some extra health, CDR and bonus CDR on the passive. This item is super strong with Achilles with its already low cooldowns. Oni Hunter's Garb is also a great magical defense option though for Achilles, as he often likes to dive backlines and be around multiple enemies at once, so he gets great use out of the mitigations passive. Hide of the Urchin is a nice pickup if you're already ahead and think you can get the passive stacked up fairly easily. Spirit Robe is a great general purpose defense item with good all-round stats. It's best used when you're being focused out by hard CC though due to that passive. Mantle of Discord is similar to Spirit Robe in that it provides great all-round defense with a bit of CDR, and that 1 second stun and CC immunity passive can be a lifesaver when you're diving backlines as Achilles. And finally, I don't recommend damage items too much from solo lane Achilles, but if I do go for a dedicated damage item, it will usually be Masamune, since it also gives some health and defenses on top of those aggressive stats. Alright, so before we move into some jungle builds for Achilles, let's cover a quick build example for solo lane. Start with Warrior's Blessing, tier 1 round shield and 3 health potions. Finish the shield into Gladiator shield, then get Warrior Tabi, Blackthorn Hammer, Void Shield, Genji's Guard, and sell your Blessing for Mantle of Discord. And if the game goes long enough, you can sell your boots for Masamune and get the Elixir of Speed. Your 2 relics as solo lane Achilles should be Teleport first and then Blink. Okay, so moving on to jungle Achilles builds. For your start, you of course want Assassin's Blessing, it's just the go-to jungle item. Then tier 1 mace, as we'll be rushing into the Crusher early on, and then get 2 potions. My personal choice for these will be 1 health and 1 multi-potion. So your first item before you finish that mace you got in your starting build needs to be boots for that movement speed because it's super important in jungle. The most popular choice right now is Talaria boots for the extra movement speed and mobility to maneuver in fights. But warrior tabi can also work here as well. It depends on your preference and the meta at the time. Then after boots are finished, go back and finish that mace you got at the start into the crusher, completing your first 2 items. After that, once again as with solo, your build can shift around depending on the current game and what you're dealing with. So here's some good items for jungle Achilles before we finish up with that full build example. So Hydra's Lament is a great item for Achilles as the auto attack cancels very well, as it can even cancel with the 2, and the 3 gives 2 AA cancels in one ability because it's a double cast. Hydras can provide a lot of extra burst damage onto your combos, so I highly recommend it. Similarly to with solo lane, Blackthorn Hammer is still great on Achilles jungle as well. It leans more towards a tanky side than a damage side, but the stats are still great even for a jungle build. Stonecutting Sword. So as I mentioned with Hydras, Achilles will often weave in auto attacks between abilities and while they're on cooldown, making Stonecutting Sword very cost effective for the insane stats it gives if you can keep the passive stacked up. Magi's Cloak is a great defensive choice if you're having trouble with hard CC. If you're getting stunned and bursted before you can land a kill, this can be a life-saving item. Masamune, similar to solo lane, this item still has some nice aggressive stats in the power and movement speed, but also gives some health and protections to keep you alive. It's a great aggressive item if you're still looking for a little bit of defense. Brawler's Beatstick is essential if you're facing healer comps, but of course if the enemy team has no significant healing, then you don't need this. Bloodforge is a high-risk, high-reward luxury item, but in my opinion it can be really strong as a late-game 5th or 6th item, since hopefully you'll be executing people at that point and getting that blood shield fairly often. And finally, Mantle of Discord applies just as it did in solo lane, just for the general purpose defense and great passive if you feel you need it, even from jungle. Alright, so let's cover that full build example for jungle Achilles for those who just need a quick build to get started with. Start with Assassin's Blessing, Mace, 1 health and 1 mana potion. Grab Talaria boots, finish your mace into the crusher, then get Hydra's Lament, Blackthorn Hammer, Stonecutting Sword, sell your blessing for Magi's Cloak, and if the game goes long enough, sell your boots for Masamune and get the Elixir of Speed. And your 2 relics for jungle should be Blink and Beads. As for support Achilles, I'm not going to cover this fully as it's not a particularly popular role for him right now. For the most part, support Achilles builds tanky. You'll want Guardian's Blessing and typical aura items such as Gauntlet of Thebes, Sovereignty and Heartward Amulets, and then some general defense on top of that. Alright, so with abilities and builds covered, let's round out the guide with a bit of some general tips and tricks to up your game as Achilles. So with the way Achilles 3, the dash, works, I highly recommend setting it to instant casting mode. Even if you don't normally use instant cast, it makes it so much easier to use and AA cancel with when you just press the button and have the ability cast immediately. And while we're on the 3, if you're using the dash to run away, I highly recommend turning around quickly and throwing the projectile at the enemy that's chasing you. This might slow you down a little bit, but if you hit an enemy god with it, you'll get that extra dash to lengthen the gap and have a better chance of getting away. Also, I may have mentioned this before, but Achilles 2, while it doesn't deal any damage itself, can be a nice way to get out some quick damage by using it as an AA cancel, allowing you to get out 2 auto attacks very quickly. This can also be a nice way to proc Hydra's Lament's passive or stack up Stonecutting Sword if you're in jungle and building those items. And the final tip for this video, since you're completely free to move and turn while casting the 1, you can actually start casting it, and then while it's in the middle of charging up, so to speak, you can quickly 180 your camera and effectively hit someone who was behind you. This can be very useful if you're being chased or if you want to just switch targets, like maybe you start the 1 but then you hear a Ymir is about to freeze you, so you quickly spin the targeter, hit the Ymir instead of a Thor for example, and stun him before the freeze can go off. But that's about it from me for this guide. As always, if you did enjoy and learned something, then don't hesitate to drop a like, share the guide around, and subscribe for more in the future. But I'll catch you guys in the next one. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.